Welcome back to Mr. Blackwood, a place where you can experience tension and terror as your bedtime introduction. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and like this video to get more scary stories every night. Now, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin tonight's scary story. The air in Philadelphia always seemed to have an eerie chill, especially at night. The sprawling city was a mixture of old buildings and new developments, but there was something about its older, neglected houses that sent shivers down the spine. Sarah Mitchell had always been one to love history. She enjoyed the rich stories that came with old places. So, when she found a small, charming house for rent in one of the city's quieter neighborhoods, she jumped at the opportunity to move in. It seemed like a fresh start. It had been weeks since she moved in, and Sarah was still in the process of settling. She loved the house, though it had a strange, almost unsettling charm to it. The wooden floors creaked with every step, and the dim lighting in the hallways gave everything a dusty, aged look. Some might have found it eerie, but Sarah liked it. It felt like a place with stories to tell. And now, as she felt the house reclaim every part of her, she realized something darker still. The cycle would continue, because in the end, Sarah was not the victim. She was the creator, the mastermind, and the house would keep her in this loop forever, its architect and its prisoner. The true horror was not that she had lost herself, but that she was the one who had built this nightmare in the first place. She wasn't the woman who had walked into this house as a victim. She wasn't the confused woman trying to piece together the broken fragments of her past. She was the one who had designed this house in the first place, the one who had woven its webs of horror, its stories, its rules. The house was an extension of her mind, her twisted need for control, her desire to bend reality to her will. Sarah had created Dr. Hawk. She had created the book. She had created the darkness. She had built it all with her own fractured mind, and now she was the one trapped inside her own creation. The footsteps above her, they were her own. The house's voice, it was her own voice, split into different parts to keep her contained, to keep her controlled. It was her own twisted reflection. She had forgotten. She had buried it. But now, as the house's grip on her tightened, she understood the truth. She had never been Sarah Mitchell. She had always been patient 467, the one who had crossed the line, the one who had crossed the boundaries of memory and identity, creating a maze that she could never escape. The darkness seemed endless, a vast, suffocating void that held Sarah captive, consuming her memories and her sense of self. She had been swallowed by the house, reshaped by its malevolent force, stripped of her name, her identity. But as the weight of her annihilation settled around her, she felt something stir, an unfamiliar sense of consciousness that seemed to flicker, like a distant memory she couldn't quite reach. And then, in a burst of clarity that sent a jolt through her, she understood. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt. She wasn't just a victim of the house. She was the architect. The voice in the darkness, the voice of Dr. Hawk, had never been her tormentor. It had always been a projection, a tool of the house, a mask that she herself had worn. Dr. Hawk wasn't an outside force. He was her, a part of her that she had discarded and forgotten, an identity she had created to manipulate the world, to control the narrative. The house had never been after Sarah Mitchell. It had been after her true self, the person she had buried deep inside, the version of her that had been pushing the boundaries of memory, of reality, of manipulation itself. In that moment, Sarah remembered everything. A deep primal scream tore from her throat as the realization crushed her. She had never been real, not in the way she thought. She was nothing but a part of the house's experiment, another subject to be consumed and rewritten until nothing was left of her, until she became nothing but a shadow in the dark. The house had never let her be herself. It had been shaping her from the beginning, shaping her memories, her thoughts, her very identity. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible as the house seemed to swallow her whole. "No more." But there was no answer. The house had already won. Dr. Hawk's voice drifted away, lost in the thick, suffocating darkness. The last thing Sarah heard was his laughter, hollow and distant. It was as if the house itself was laughing, mocking her, celebrating its victory. And then everything went silent. In the void, In the darkness where Sarah's thoughts should have been, she could feel the house begin to reshape her once again. Her name, her identity, everything she had once been began to dissolve, swallowed by the house. The very essence of her being was being consumed, reshaped, and reborn as part of the house's eternal cycle. There was no longer a Sarah Mitchell. There was only the house. And as the house began to rebuild itself piece by piece, Sarah, the last vestige of her, was no more. It can't be. The words barely formed in her mind. It can, Sarah, and it has, Dr. Hawk's voice hissed. You were never meant to leave this place. You were never meant to be the person you think you are. You were always meant to become part of this house's story. You were always meant to become this house. A sudden flash of memory surged in her mind. The book, the journal, the pages filled with her name, her every movement documented in blood, the growing sense of déjà vu, the twisted reflection she had seen in the dark. And then it hit her. The truth wasn't that she was trapped in the house. The truth was that she had always been a part of it. Her existence, her memories, everything she thought she knew was part of the house's twisted narrative. It was feeding off her, bending her reality to its will. The moment she stepped into the house, she had been absorbed into its insidious cycle, and the house had been rewriting her existence from that moment on. Her memories, her thoughts, her very identity were part of the house's story now, a never-ending loop of manipulation, fear, and consumption. She wasn't Sarah Mitchell. She was patient 467. The house seemed to laugh, a deep rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It echoed through her mind, feeding off her desperation, off her fear. You never will, Dr. Hawk said, his tone dripping with something between amusement and pity. Because you're not meant to understand. This place, this house, it exists outside of you. It's not bound by your laws of reality. It doesn't need to explain itself. The darkness seemed to pulse around her, like the beating of a heart, and Sarah's pulse quickened in response. Panic surged within her as she tried to grasp onto any shred of logic, any way to understand what was happening. But the more she thought, the less coherent her thoughts became. It was as if the very act of thinking was being stripped away from her, piece by piece. You see, Sarah, Dr. Hawk continued, his voice growing louder, this house is not just a place. It's a doorway, a gateway, and once you enter it, there's no escape. The house claims you, not as a victim, but as a vessel. It reshapes you, consumes you, until you are nothing but an extension of its will. Terror gripped her chest like a vice, squeezing the air from her lungs. A vessel. The word twisted in her mind, and she felt the weight of its meaning settle on her like a cold, suffocating shroud. Sarah's breath hitched as the darkness swallowed her whole. It wasn't like any darkness she had ever experienced before. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was something alive, suffocating, twisting around her. She tried to move, but her body refused to obey. The oppressive weight of the house, of the malevolent force that had taken hold of her, anchored her in place. Her skin crawled as invisible tendrils seemed to wrap around her limbs, holding her there, suspended in the void. The air was thick with an unholy silence. She could no longer hear her own breath, no longer feel the familiar beat of her heart. It was as if she had been cut off from herself, isolated in the depths of something other. The feeling of being watched, of being consumed, was overwhelming. And then a voice, his voice, broke through the silence. Do you understand now, Sarah? Dr. Hawk's voice reverberated in the darkness, smooth and cold. Do you see the truth? Sarah's mind was spinning, racing to comprehend what was happening. The words were like knives, cutting through the haze of terror that surrounded her. She could feel her thoughts unraveling, each one slipping through her fingers like water. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible in the suffocating darkness. I don't understand. Please, make it stop. Sarah. Dr. Hawk's voice was now a low, guttural whisper, a sound that made her skin crawl. The house isn't just a place. It's a living entity, and it's time for you to understand its power. It has already claimed you, and now it will reshape you, make you a part of its story, a story that will never end. With that, the room plunged into darkness. No, "No," she cried out, but her voice was drowned out by the rising hum that filled the room. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, warping the room's shape as the pressure around her intensified. Dr. Hawk's figure seemed to blur, his face twisting into something more grotesque. "This is where it all begins, Sarah," he said, his voice shifting, becoming something darker, more sinister. "This is where the house takes its final possession." As the shadows closed in around her, Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let the house take over, consume her like it had consumed so many others before her. She fought against the pressure, against the strange force pulling at her, but it was no use. The house was too powerful. It was everywhere, in every breath she took, in every inch of the room. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the floorboards creaking in protest, as if the house itself was reacting to her resistance. The red glow from earlier flickered in the corners of the room, casting an eerie light on the walls. It was then that Sarah realized the house wasn't just alive. It was feeding off her fear, feeding off her resistance, growing stronger with each passing second. "No," she screamed, her voice raw, filled with terror. "This can't be happening. I won't let you do this to me." But her words fell flat in the stillness of the room. The air seemed to thicken, pushing down on her, drowning her in its suffocating grip. The house was alive, its presence all-encompassing, and no matter how much she struggled, no matter how hard she fought to break free, it wouldn't let her go. "Fight all you want," Dr. Hawk said with a dark chuckle, his voice growing colder still. "It's useless. You're already part of the house. It owns you now. It's been waiting for you. And now, it's time for the final phase." The last sentence hung in the air like a death sentence as Sarah's body tensed, fear coursing through her veins. The final phase. What did that mean? What was going to happen next? Before she could respond, she felt a strange pull, a pressure at the base of her spine, drawing her toward the center of the room. Her limbs moved against her will, like a marionette caught in the strings of an unseen hand. She tried to resist, to fight the compulsion that was pulling her, but it was useless. The house had a hold on her, and it wasn't letting go. His words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over again until they became a chant she couldn't shake off. There was no escape. The house had claimed her from the moment she walked in. She was part of the experiment, part of the twisted narrative that the house had been writing, and now there was no way out. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking as she shook her head in disbelief. "I won't be a part of this. I won't let you win." Dr. Hawk's smile grew wider, colder. "It's not up to you anymore, Sarah. You think you're special? You think you're different? But you're not. You're just another soul the house has claimed. Just another piece in the puzzle." Sarah's chest tightened as the weight of his words sank in. The house had been waiting for her. It had been waiting for all of them, the broken, the lost, the curious, the ones who stumbled upon its secrets. And once they were drawn in, they were never allowed to leave. The house didn't let go. It never let go. She turned, glancing desperately at the walls, the windows, the door, but they all remained the same, closed, locked, unreachable. There was no way out. The house had sealed her fate. She was part of the game now, part of the twisted ritual that had been set in motion long before she had arrived. The darkness around Sarah thickened, pressing in on her like a weight she could no longer escape. The walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent rhythm, as if the house itself were alive, breathing, watching her every move. Her heart raced, her limbs frozen in place as Dr. Hawk's presence loomed closer. "You really think you can just walk away from this?" Dr. Hawk's voice was low, but it echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls like a sinister melody. He took another step forward, and Sarah instinctively stepped back, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way out. But the house was closing in, its shadows stretching longer, its corners darkening until there was nowhere left to run. Her breath quickened, chest tight as the cold air seeped into her skin. It wasn't just the temperature that had dropped. It was something deeper, something more insidious. The very air in the room seemed thick with the weight of the house's power, as if it were trying to suffocate her, crush her spirit. "You're trapped, Sarah," Dr. Hawk continued, his words sliding over her like a cold, slick serpent. "The house has already claimed you. You were never meant to leave. You were never meant to escape. The room seemed to darken, the shadows growing heavier, the walls pressing in closer. She could feel the presence of the house all around her, its pulse matching her own. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. The house had chosen her. And now, it was time to play its final game. Dr. Hawk stepped closer, his eyes glinting with something malicious. You see, Sarah, you were never meant to be the observer. You were always meant to be the subject of the house's experiment. The book wasn't just some journal. It was a record of your existence, your every move, your every thought. It was a map to pull you deeper into the web until you were completely consumed. She recoiled, her hands trembling. Why me? She asked, her voice breaking. Why me? Why did you pick me? He chuckled darkly, shaking his head. It's not about picking you. You were always drawn here, just as the others were before you. You were chosen by the house long before you even stepped foot inside it. It doesn't matter who you are, what you've done. The house decides. And once you're here, you're part of it. As he spoke, the temperature in the room dropped again. Sarah could see her breath fogging in front of her, the shadows around them stretching, swirling. She could feel the house closing in around her, suffocating her, pulling her deeper into its grasp. No, she whispered, I won't be part of this. I won't let you control me. Dr. Hawk's eyes gleamed with an unsettling mix of pity and amusement. You have no choice, Sarah. It's already too late. You think you're the first, Dr. Hawk continued, a sinister smile curling on his lips. But you're not. There have been many before you. Every person who has ever entered this house. They all follow the same pattern. They read the book, they discover their place in the house's story, and then they fade away, just like the rest. Sarah's mind reeled as the weight of his words sank in. She wasn't the first person to be caught in this nightmare, and she wouldn't be the last. The house had been here long before her, and it would remain long after she was gone. You're using us, she whispered, the realization chilling her to the bone. All of us. We're nothing more than experiments for you. Dr. Hawk's smile widened. You don't understand. This isn't about me using you, Sarah. This is about the house. This house is a living entity, an extension of something much older. It feeds off fear, off the unknown. It draws in the lost, the broken, the curious. And once it has you, it doesn't let go. Sarah's breath hitched. A living house? It sounded insane, but everything she had experienced since entering this place, the whispers, the figures, the red ink, the book, it all pointed to something beyond her comprehension, something more than just a haunted house. You've been part of the experiment from the beginning, Dr. Hawk continued, his voice growing colder with each word. This house, it's not just a house, it's a place of control. I built it piece by piece, and I've been watching you ever since you stepped through that door. Sarah shook her head, her chest tightening as the full weight of his words settled in. No, this can't be real. It can't be. It is real, Sarah, he said, his eyes narrowing. This house has its own purpose. It was designed to pull people like you in, people with unresolved trauma, people whose minds are fragile. And I've watched you, just as I've watched all the others. Every detail of your life, every little crack in your psyche. I knew you would find the book. I knew you would read it. And now you understand the truth. Sarah felt the room spin around her. She clutched the edge of the desk for support, her head spinning as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. The memories, the fragmented thoughts, everything she had experienced in this house, it was all part of the same twisted game. The voice came again, the same low rasp that had haunted her since she opened the book. But this time, it was not a whisper. It was louder, more commanding, as if it were coming directly from behind her. She spun around, her breath shallow, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall and thin, his figure obscured by shadows. But it wasn't the figure she had seen before. No, this man was different. He was older, his face gaunt and worn, his eyes dark but alive with an unsettling, almost predatory gleam. He stepped forward, and the floor creaked under his weight. The room felt colder, the shadows pressing in from all sides. Sarah's mind reeled, and her pulse quickened as she realized this was the man from the medical files. This was Dr. William Hawke. "You found it," he said, his voice thick with something that might have been amusement, but it was tinged with something darker. "You shouldn't have found it, Sarah. You were never meant to know." She backed away, her eyes locked on his. The truth was now undeniable. Dr. Hawke wasn't just a doctor. He wasn't just someone who had been experimenting on her. He was the architect of her nightmare. The house, the book, the figures, the voice, it had all been a carefully constructed trap. A trap designed to ensnare her. The realization crashed over Sarah like a wave. The house wasn't just a passive participant in the horrors she was experiencing. It was an active player. It had been waiting for her, just as the figure had said, waiting for her to enter, to stumble upon the book, to follow its twisted trail of breadcrumbs. And now, as the footsteps above her grew louder, closer, she understood. This house was alive, and it had been alive long before she had ever stepped foot inside it. The walls seemed to breathe, the floorboards groaning underfoot, as if the house itself was stretching and shifting, preparing for the next phase of its grotesque ritual. Sarah felt like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings, her every movement dictated by a force she could neither understand nor escape. The footsteps from above were now rapid, frantic. They were coming down the stairs, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Panic surged within her, but she couldn't bring herself to run. She felt rooted to the spot, her legs stiff, her mind racing but unable to act. She had read enough, seen enough. She knew the truth now, but it was a truth she couldn't face. Sarah. The room was still, silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead lamp. She hesitated, fear creeping up her spine. The door had opened by itself, but there was no one in sight. Yet the sense of dread grew, pressing against her chest, suffocating her once again. Taking a deep breath, Sarah moved toward the door. Her mind was racing with questions, but one question kept rising to the surface above all others. Was Dr. Hawke really a part of this? Was he the one who had manipulated her into this nightmare? Had he been watching her all along? The footsteps from upstairs started again, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty house. Sarah's heart sank. The figure was here. It was closer than ever. And then she realized something even more terrifying. The house wasn't just trapping her, it was pulling her into the cycle, over and over again. There was no way out. There never had been. The doctor had been watching her, yes, but he wasn't the only one. The house had already chosen her. Sarah's stomach churned as her gaze flew from the page to the darkness in the corner of the room. Was she patient 467? The realization hit her with the force of a punch to the gut. The records were about her. This house, this place, wasn't just a home. It was a laboratory, a place where experiments had been conducted, where she had been experimented on. A cold sweat broke out across her skin as her thoughts spiraled. Was this all some sort of twisted experiment? Had Dr. Hawke, whoever he was, been involved in manipulating her memories, changing her reality? Had he planted the book in the basement, knowing she would find it, knowing it would slowly drive her mad? The details of the report, the mention of the pre-existing experiment, made her realize the house wasn't just haunted. It had been used for something much darker, much more twisted. The sound of the front door creaking open snapped Sarah out of her thoughts, her heart leaping in her chest. She turned around, her pulse racing, her breath quickening. Had someone entered the house? Was it Dr. Hawke? Was it the figure from before? Her breath caught in her throat. Dr. William Hawke. The name was unfamiliar, but it resonated with her. Something about it gnawed at the back of her mind, like the remnants of a dream she couldn't quite remember. The reports detailed extensive treatment plans, consultations, and medical procedures. She read on, her eyes widening with each line, the unease growing within her. One entry, dated just a few months before she had moved into the house, stood out to her. Patient 467, subject remains unresponsive despite the treatment. Significant memory loss observed. Further investigation into cognitive treatment required. Dr. Hawke to implement memory erasure procedure. Further testing to follow. The words on the page blurred as Sarah's mind struggled to process what she was reading. Memory erasure? What did this have to do with her? She couldn't believe it. Could Dr. Hawk have been involved in something so sinister? She turned to the next page, desperate for more answers. But her heart stopped when she saw the next report. The entry was dated shortly after her move to the house. Patient 467, subject now residing at previous location. No known history prior to moving in. Symptoms similar to prior patients. Amnesia and heightened susceptibility to suggestion. Initiate phase 2 of the treatment protocol. Recommend monitoring and integration with pre-existing experiment. She felt the compulsion to get up, to leave the suffocating room, to find some way out. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself up off the floor. She wiped away the cold sweat that had accumulated on her brow, trying to steady her breath. But the house was silent now, eerily still, as if the shadows were watching her, waiting for her next move. As she stood in the middle of the room trying to gather her thoughts, her eyes fell on the desk in the corner. A small lamp illuminated the area, casting a faint glow over a stack of papers. A series of neatly arranged folders caught her attention, medical files, each labeled with a name, an entry number, and a date. Her pulse quickened. Medical files? It didn't make sense. She hadn't seen any sign of a doctor or any indication that there was a medical history tied to this house. But something deep inside her told her that these files were important. She had to know what they contained. With trembling hands, Sarah approached the desk and picked up the first file. She opened it carefully, feeling the weight of the pages inside. The folder was filled with typed documents, reports, medical history, case notes. She scanned through the pages, but there was one name that kept appearing at the top of each sheet: Dr. William Hawk. Sarah's breath was ragged as she sat frozen on the floor, her hands clutching the edges of the rug beneath her. The reflection in the dark, a twisted version of herself, stared back at her, its eyes hollow, its mouth twisted in a grotesque grin. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the very house was alive, suffocating her with its presence. Her heart was pounding in her chest, the beats erratic and desperate, as if they too were trying to escape. She could still hear the voice echoing in her mind. It had been speaking to her for what felt like an eternity, taunting her, telling her things that her sanity struggled to accept. "You're not the first," the voice had said, "and you won't be the last." The words looped in her mind like a broken record. What did that mean? Who was before her? Who else had been brought into this house, caught in its malevolent grasp, only to be lost to its darkness? And more importantly, why her? Why now? But as the reflection in the shadows began to fade, its twisted form disappearing into the corners of the room, the pressure in her chest only grew. Her breathing became shallow, her thoughts scattered. There was no way she could face this alone. She needed answers. She needed someone who could help her, someone who could explain what was happening. But who? She could hear the voice again, but this time it wasn't speaking to her. It was speaking about her. "She doesn't know," it said, the tone mocking. "She doesn't understand. She thinks she's special. She thinks she's the first. But she's not. She's the latest. And she'll never leave." The words echoed in her mind, bouncing around the empty room like a sinister chant. Her knees buckled and she sank to the floor. Her hands trembled as they pressed against her ears, as if she could shut out the voice. But it wasn't enough. The voice was inside her mind now, burrowing deep into her thoughts, wrapping around her sanity. And then there was the flicker of something in the corner of her eye. She turned, and in the darkness she saw it, an image of herself, standing alone, her body twisted and contorted in an unnatural way. The figure grinned back at her with that same twisted smile. But this time, it wasn't just an image. It was a reflection in the dark. "Do you see now?" the voice whispered as Sarah's heart froze. She was not alone, she never had been. The voice replied, its tone full of amusement. "Who am I?" It chuckled softly, as if the question were a game. "I am everything you feared, everything you've ignored. I am the past, the present, and the future of this house. I've been here for far longer than you realize, and now you're a part of it." A rush of memories, images that weren't her own, flooded Sarah's mind. They weren't her thoughts, but they were so vivid, so real, that they felt like they were. She saw flashes of a man, older than her, standing at the same window she had stared out of countless times. His face was twisted in fear, his eyes wide with terror as he looked out into the darkened street. The house, it seemed, was always watching. Then the images shifted. There was a woman now, standing in a room that felt strangely familiar, like the very room she was standing in now. But the woman's face was contorted in anguish, her mouth open in a silent scream. And then Sarah saw herself. Only it wasn't her. It was a version of herself, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes hollow, as if the very life had been drained from her. The vision abruptly ended, leaving Sarah gasping for breath, her body trembling with terror. The red glow in the shadows intensified again, a pulsating force that seemed to draw the very air from her lungs. A voice echoed from the darkness, low and chilling. "Leaving already?" Sarah froze, her heart thundering in her chest. She knew that voice. It was the same voice that had haunted her since the moment she opened the book. The voice of the figure that had watched her every move. The voice that had claimed her as its own. It spoke again, this time with an almost gleeful amusement. "You can't leave, not now, not when you've seen what's really inside." Sarah's skin prickled with fear. The voice was close, closer than before, and it wasn't just a voice now. There was movement, an unmistakable presence that lingered just behind her. She could feel it, a cold, oppressive weight in the air pressing in on her. Without thinking, she spun around to face whatever was behind her. But there was nothing. The room was empty, the walls blank and featureless, just as they had been before. The red glow, however, still pulsed from somewhere in the shadows. She couldn't see its source, but she knew it was there. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice barely a whisper. She hated how weak it sounded, how powerless she felt. She wasn't in control anymore. This place, this entity, had already claimed her. It had been watching her since the moment she stepped into the house, luring her deeper and deeper into its twisted grip. She turned back toward the living room and then froze. There, just beyond the threshold of the door, was something that hadn't been there before. A faint, almost imperceptible glow. It pulsed softly, casting an eerie light on the walls around it. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She recognized that glow. It was the same red glow she had seen in the figure's eyes. She felt it before she saw it. A rush of cold air that swept through the house, extinguishing the faint light overhead. The red glow grew brighter as it spread, illuminating the room with an unnatural intensity. It seemed to grow with each passing second, filling the space with a sense of dread. Sarah stumbled backward, her breath hitching. The book fell from her hands, hitting the floor with a soft thud. She knew, deep down, that whatever was happening was no longer just a figment of her imagination. This wasn't just a haunted house, a random collection of oddities. It was something far darker, something far older, and it had been waiting for her. She turned around quickly, making her way to the door. She had to get out of there. There had to be a way to break free, to escape the madness that was closing in on her. But the moment her hand touched the doorknob, the temperature in the room dropped drastically, and the faint red glow intensified. The house was quiet again, too quiet. But the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like something was lurking just beyond the edge of her consciousness, waiting to pounce. The walls seemed to be closing in on Sarah as she stood there, trembling with the book still clutched in her hands. The discovery she had just made had left her reeling. Her name, in the book. The same red ink, the same words, the same ominous promise. It was all too much. She tried to think, to piece together the fragments of the puzzle that were scattered in her mind like shattered glass. But no matter how hard she tried, the pieces didn't fit together in any meaningful way. How was it possible that her name was in that book? How had the figure known about her? And why did the house feel like it was alive, watching her, controlling her movements? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft, thudding sound. It was distant at first, but it grew louder. Her heart raced as the sound drew closer. It was coming from upstairs, from the darkened hallway where the figure had stood just moments before. Fear surged through her, and her first instinct was to run. But her legs felt heavy, and her body refused to move. She was trapped, physically, emotionally, mentally. This house, this cursed place, had a hold on her. No matter what she did, she couldn't escape its pull. Her mind reeled. How was that possible? How could her name be in the book, written by someone who had lived here before her? The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The answer was right in front of her, hidden in plain sight. The truth was darker than she could ever have imagined. She wasn't the first to live here. She wasn't the first to be drawn into the house. This had happened before, and it would happen again. And now she understood the worst part. The figure had been waiting for her. The house had been waiting for her. It wasn't just a haunted place, it was a prison. She had been drawn into it, unknowingly, and now there was no way out. But there was one thing that didn't make sense. One detail that had been bothering her since she first found the book. The name. The name of the previous occupant. The one who had written the entries in the diary. Who were they? What had happened to them? Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece everything together. The figure had mentioned that she was never meant to escape, but who had written the book? Who had been before her? She hurried back to the basement, her heart racing again as she grabbed the book from the floor. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. The ink was still there, the dark red ink that felt alive, almost like it was breathing with her. She had to find answers. She had to understand how this had all come to be. Then she found it. The name. It was there at the bottom of the last page, scrawled in the same red ink. And the name was familiar, too familiar. It was her own. But as she reached for the door handle, she stopped. Her hand hovered in midair, frozen. Her heart stopped for a moment. The door wasn't locked, it was sealed shut. With a gasp, she pulled on the handle again. Nothing. The door wouldn't budge. It was as though the house itself had become a cage, trapping her inside. Panicking, Sarah backed away from the door, her breath ragged. She tried the windows, the back door, but it was all the same. No matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried to escape, the house wouldn't let her out. She was trapped. The walls around her seemed to close in, pressing against her, as if the house was alive and feeding on her fear. She felt it. This wasn't just about the figure anymore. This wasn't just about the book. Something more sinister was at play. Her thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of it all. The book, she thought it was just a journal, a record of the previous occupant's ramblings. But it wasn't just that. The words in it, the strange ink, the references to her very life. It wasn't just a story, it was a map of her existence, a record of her every move, a way to draw her in. Suddenly the figure lunged forward, and Sarah recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. The cold air surrounding her grew even more oppressive, suffocating. Her body refused to move, her mind paralyzed by fear. But then, in an instant, the figure froze. Its glowing red eyes widened, as though something had caught its attention, something behind Sarah. She didn't dare turn around. She couldn't bring herself to do it. The figure spoke again, this time with a voice full of frustration and something else, something almost desperate. "You were supposed to stay in the dark. I warned you." Sarah's heart raced. What was happening? What had just shifted? She could feel it, the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle change that suggested something had intervened. Without another word, the figure stepped back, disappearing into the shadows, with an almost unnatural speed. The air cleared, the oppressive weight lifting from her chest. She was left alone again, trembling in the dim hallway. Sarah wasted no time. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with terror. She turned toward the front door, desperate to escape. She wasn't sure where she was running, but she knew she had to get away. She had to leave this cursed house behind. She couldn't let whatever that thing was, whatever force had claimed her, win.
"You shouldn't have read the book," it said, its voice low, distorted, and filled with malice. "Now there is no way out. You were never meant to escape." The words were like a punch to her gut, leaving her breathless. She knew deep down that the voice wasn't just some random threat. It was a promise that she couldn't undo, no matter how hard she tried. The figure took another step, and this time Sarah could see it more clearly. The face, obscured moments before, was now visible in the shadows, a grotesque mask of pale, sickly skin, hollow eyes, and a twisted grin that stretched unnaturally wide. It was a face she couldn't place, yet somehow it felt familiar, as if it had always been there, lurking in the recesses of her mind. I didn't know, she whispered, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the floor, trying to push herself away from the advancing figure. I didn't know what I was getting into. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though considering her words, then leaned forward, its grin widening even more. Of course you didn't, it said, its voice dripping with venom. But now you know too much. You've seen too much, and it's all too late. The figure's glowing red eyes were all Sarah could see. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the shadowy form that stood just out of reach. The air around her seemed to thicken, pressing down on her, as though the entire house was alive, watching her, trapping her in its grasp. The hallway, once familiar and mundane, had become an endless expanse of darkness and dread. She tried to move, to get up and run, but her body wouldn't obey. It felt as though her limbs were weighed down by an invisible force, like her feet were stuck in concrete. Panic surged through her. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat, choking her. The figure took a slow step forward, and with it, the temperature in the hallway dropped drastically. Sarah could see her breath puffing out in front of her, the coldness wrapping around her like a tightening vice. The figure's movements were deliberate, each step measured, as if it were savoring the moment. Why are you doing this? Sarah finally managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper, but the figure heard it. The shadow's shape seemed to shift, its form becoming more defined in the dim light, and then that chilling voice responded. Sarah turned around slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Standing at the other end of the hallway, just beyond the darkness, was a figure, a tall, shadowy form, its features obscured by the dim light. But the eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. They were glowing, an unnatural shade of red that made her blood run cold. Come to me, the figure whispered, its voice now an eerie hiss. Sarah's legs gave way. She collapsed to the floor, the book slipping from her hand and falling with a soft thud onto the floor beside her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. The figure was drawing closer now, the red eyes fixed on her, the air growing colder with each step. It wasn't just the house that was haunted. It wasn't just the book. It was her. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner of her eye. She whipped her head around, but the hallway was still empty. Her heart pounded, and she began to back away step by step toward the front door. She needed to get out. She needed to escape. But then she stopped. There, on the wall in front of her, something caught her eye. It was a message, written in the same red ink that had been in the book. It wasn't just a sentence, it was a warning. You can't leave, you will never leave. The words were written in a hasty scrawl, smeared in places as though the writer had been in a hurry, or worse, panic. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She looked around, but the house seemed to be closing in on her, its walls pressing tighter, suffocating her. The words on the wall felt like a trap. They felt like a proclamation of what was to come, an inevitability. And then, from behind her, she heard the voice again. Sarah. This time the voice was closer, almost directly behind her. The tone was no longer just a whisper. It was commanding, menacing, as if it belonged to someone who had been waiting for this moment for far too long. But the footsteps above her moved again. They were at the top of the stairs now, just out of her sight. Sarah's pulse raced as she felt the weight of the book in her hand. It was still warm, almost unnervingly so, as though it had absorbed the fear in the air. She couldn't just leave it behind. She had to know more. She had to understand what was happening to her, to this house, to the strange presence that was now after her. The footsteps came closer, and without thinking, Sarah bolted up the stairs. She heard a loud bang above her, the door at the top of the stairs slamming open with a force that rattled the walls. She sprinted up, her legs burning from the sudden exertion, but the air felt heavy, as if something was pulling her back. She didn't dare look behind her. As she reached the top of the stairs, she saw the hallway ahead, empty. It was bathed in the dim light of a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The house was silent now, eerily still, as if it were waiting for her. But there was something wrong. The air smelled off, like something stale and decaying. She felt her pulse quicken again, her hand gripping the banister for support. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. It couldn't be.
The voice wasn't someone she recognized. Was it a dream? A hallucination? She didn't know anymore, but there was no denying it. The voice called her name again, this time louder and clearer, as if mocking her. "Sarah, you're mine now." Her blood ran cold. The words from the book echoed in her mind, blending with the chilling voice from above. She gripped the railing of the basement stairs, her knuckles white, the book still pressed against her chest. There was no more room for doubt. Someone had been watching her, observing her every move. The book hadn't just recorded her life, it had been a means to something else. She was being drawn into this twisted web, and the house, the very walls around her, seemed to be part of it. There was no escaping it. She turned, glancing back into the basement. The shadows seemed to shift, moving in unnatural ways, as though they were alive, watching her. Her heart thudded against her ribcage, the sound echoing in her ears. She wasn't safe here. She had to leave. She had to find a way out. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah felt a cold sweat break out on her brow. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to move, to run, to do something, anything. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. The stillness stretched out, endless, and with it came an overwhelming sense of being trapped. There was no escape, no way out. Then the sound returned. A door upstairs creaked open, followed by the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet moving across the floor. The footsteps grew closer, now on the staircase leading down into the basement. Sarah's eyes widened as she realized that whoever, or whatever, was upstairs was now coming for her. Panic surged through her, but her legs felt like lead. She pushed herself up from the floor, the book still clutched tightly in her hand, and stumbled toward the basement stairs. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight, but the urge to run, to get away, overpowered everything else. She made it to the foot of the stairs, but just as she was about to ascend, the footsteps paused. "Sarah." The voice was barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It was low, raspy, and so familiar. Her heart skipped a beat. It was her name. It was coming from upstairs. The sound of the footsteps above her continued to echo in Sarah's ears. Each step, a rhythmic, deliberate movement that seemed to grow louder as it closed in on her. She could hear the creaking of floorboards, the soft thud of shoes landing on the wood. Her body stiffened as her breath quickened, heart pounding erratically in her chest. Sarah didn't dare move. She felt paralyzed, as if some invisible force was holding her in place, preventing her from escaping. The basement, once an ordinary, albeit unsettling place, now felt like a prison. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, more suffocating. The air was thick with dread, and the only sound was the slow, measured steps above her. Her hand trembled as it reached for the edge of the wooden book that lay on the floor before her. It felt as though it had somehow become a symbol of everything she was afraid of. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the book. The words inside had already taken hold of her, like an unseen force wrapping around her mind, squeezing tighter with each turn of the page. The idea that someone had been watching her, that someone knew things about her life that even she hadn't realized, made her stomach turn. But this was more than just a journal. This was something darker, something far more sinister. And now someone was in her house. The footsteps above her stopped. The footsteps grew louder, closer. It wasn't her imagination. Someone was in the house. She wasn't alone. The ink on the page was smudged, like it had been written in a rush. But there was something more, something she hadn't noticed before. The handwriting on this page didn't belong to the same person who had written the other entries. This was different. This was more erratic, jagged. And there, in the corner of the page, was something that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. She knows now. She knows. Her heart pounded in her chest. She dropped the book as if it had burned her. It thudded to the floor, its pages now open, revealing those haunting words. Someone else had been writing in the book. But who? And more importantly, how did they know? She scrambled back against the basement wall, her breath coming in short gasps. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she had to get out of the basement. She had to get away from this house. But before she could make it to the stairs, something stopped her. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, but there. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, just above her. It was as if someone was walking through the house, just above her, pacing back and forth. The house seemed to close in on her, the walls feeling suffocating as Sarah's body stiffened in fear. I will watch until I know everything about you, until I am inside your mind, inside your soul. And then, when you are finally mine, there will be nothing left of you, nothing left but my own. The words bled off the page, the ink darkening as if it had been written in something thicker than just a pen. It was as though the page itself was alive, as if the very act of writing had transformed the ink into something more, something sinister. Sarah's stomach churned as she struggled to process what she had just read. Then, a cold realization hit her. The words weren't just threatening her, they were claiming her. The book was not merely a journal, it was an invasion, a documentation of her life, her every movement, and her very being. It was as though the writer wasn't just observing her, they were controlling her, pulling the strings of her existence with every word. She needed to stop. She needed to throw the book away, burn it, destroy it, anything to rid herself of whatever curse it had placed upon her. But as her hands hovered over the pages, she noticed something in the next entry that made her blood run cold. She spends too much time alone. I can hear her voice echoing in the empty house. The humming is comforting. The house is starting to belong to her, but not for long. I will take it back. Sarah's heart sank. Every sentence felt like a cold hand was closing around her chest, squeezing tighter with each new page she turned. Who was writing this? What did they mean by taking it back? Was this some kind of sick game? She wanted to stop reading, to close the book and forget it ever existed, but she couldn't. Every word in those pages seemed like an inescapable pull that drew her deeper into a web she didn't understand. Her fingers trembled as they turned another page, the paper feeling fragile beneath her fingertips. The words were getting darker now, more urgent, as if the writer's fear, or perhaps their obsession, was intensifying. I've watched you with the curtains drawn. You think no one sees, but I am always here, waiting in the shadows. Your footsteps echo in my mind. You are mine. A wave of nausea hit Sarah. This was too much. She couldn't take it. She wanted to scream, to throw the book across the room, but something held her still. A part of her, the same part that had led her to open the box in the first place, insisted that she keep reading, that she find the answers to the questions that were gnawing at her mind. Sarah's eyes widened as the words sank in. She felt a lump form in her throat. It was all too much, too real. There was no denying it now. Whoever wrote this was watching her. She hadn't mentioned anything about herself to anyone when she moved in, yet somehow this person knew details she hadn't even told a single soul. There was no doubt in her mind anymore. She was being observed. Her mind raced with a dozen different thoughts, all of them trying to connect the dots, but they only led to more questions. The basement was silent again. The house seemed unnaturally quiet, too quiet. Her gaze darted from one shadowy corner of the room to the next. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something was right behind her, watching her read every line in the book. Desperately trying to push aside her rising anxiety, Sarah forced herself to keep reading. The next pages were filled with small observations, little things that no one would typically notice. They spoke of her daily routines, how she had been seen sweeping the porch every morning before the sun had fully risen, the way she liked to sit by the window and read her books, how she would sometimes hum softly to herself as she moved through the house. The entries felt so deeply personal, as though the writer had been following her for months, intimately aware of her life in ways that terrified her. The next few minutes felt like hours. Sarah sat in the basement, gripping the book in her hands, as if it were a lifeline, yet it was simultaneously something she couldn't wait to be rid of. The echoing silence around her felt like it was pressing in, the words from the book reverberating in her mind. You are mine now. The sentence repeated itself like a mantra, the ominous finality of it settling heavily in her chest. But she couldn't look away. She couldn't just let the book slip back into the darkness of the basement where she'd found it. Despite the creeping dread she felt, something inside her, the same curiosity that had made her open the box in the first place, drove her to continue reading. She had to understand what this was. Who had written this, and most importantly, why her? Shaking, Sarah forced herself to flip open the book again. Her fingers brushed against the old, brittle pages, and she hesitated before reading the first words that caught her eye on the next page. I see you watching the house. I know your every move. I know when you sleep, and I know when you're awake. It's too late to run. It's already begun. She looked around the basement, her eyes darting to every corner, convinced that someone was watching her. But there was no one there, just the shadows. The oppressive silence of the basement surrounded her, and she felt as though she were trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't escape. The words from the book echoed in her mind, repeating themselves over and over again, getting louder and louder. You are mine now. Her gaze returned to the book, her hands still shaking. She couldn't let it go. She had to know more. What was happening? Why was her name in that book? Why had she found it? And who was watching her? In that moment, Sarah realized she had stumbled upon something far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. The book wasn't just a journal, it was a warning, and now she was part of its story. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She felt as though the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She read the words again, her eyes widening in disbelief. It couldn't be. This couldn't be about her. She had never seen this book before, but there it was, her name, scrawled on the page, as if someone had known she would one day read it. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions, but none of them seemed to have an answer. She could feel the blood rushing to her head, her breath shallow, as if something was closing in on her. Who had written this? How did they know her name? The words that followed sent a cold shiver down her spine. I've watched you since you moved in. I see everything. I know your every step, your every move. You will never escape me. I've been waiting for you. You are mine now. Sarah slammed the book shut, her heart hammering in her chest. She felt lightheaded, her hands trembling. The book seemed to be burning her hands, as though the very object itself was somehow alive, feeding off her fear. She wanted to throw it away, burn it, do anything to rid herself of the horrific words written in blood, but she couldn't move. The book felt like a heavy weight, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The ink on the page grew darker, and the writing became more jagged and uneven, as if someone was writing in a hurry, their hands shaking uncontrollably. Sarah's eyes widened as she read the chilling words. I can feel it now. It watches me in the dark, listens to my every movement. Every step I take, I can hear it. The footsteps behind me. It's always there. I can't escape it. It knows what I think. It's been waiting. I know it has. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Her breath caught in her throat, and she closed the book momentarily, heart racing. The words echoed in her mind, and the once cozy basement now felt suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on her. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. It was just a journal, she told herself. A writer who had gone mad. She would put it back and forget about it. But there was something else, something that pulled her back to the book. The next pages were different. The handwriting had changed again, now appearing sloppier and hastier. The ink looked different too. As Sarah skimmed through the new entries, she realized with horror that the ink wasn't just black. It was a deep, dark red. Her heart began to race as she read the next words, written in what appeared to be blood. Sarah Mitchell, her name, written in blood. The first few pages were filled with neat handwriting, a diary of an ordinary life. The entries spoke of someone who had been in this house before her. It described mundane tasks, the people who lived nearby, and the usual weather patterns. At first, Sarah found herself feeling a sense of comfort, thinking that the book was merely a collection of ordinary reflections. The handwriting, while old-fashioned, was legible, and the content seemed harmless enough. But as she turned the pages, the entries began to shift. The once neat script started to grow more erratic, the ink seemingly blotching as if the author had been rushed or in a state of distress. Sarah paused, feeling an unsettling unease creep up her spine. There were references to strange occurrences, noises in the house at night, objects moving seemingly on their own, and feelings of being watched. Sarah couldn't help but shiver as she read the words. She had never experienced anything out of the ordinary in the house, but now she felt a sense of foreboding, as though the house itself was alive with secrets. On the next page, the handwriting became increasingly frantic. The author spoke of someone or something watching them. It seemed like the writer was being driven mad by the constant feeling of being observed. The diary entries began to sound more like the ramblings of a person unraveling under the pressure of fear. It wasn't what Sarah expected. Inside the box was an old book, a diary by the looks of it. Its leather cover was worn and cracked, and it felt strangely warm to the touch, as if it had been waiting to be discovered. Sarah carefully lifted the book out of the box, feeling an odd sense of dread wash over her. She looked at the cover, but there was no title, no indication of who it belonged to. It looked as though it had been sitting there for years, untouched. The pages seemed yellowed, but still firm. She couldn't explain why, but her fingers trembled as she ran them across the surface. She didn't know why she decided to open it, but there was something magnetic about it, drawing her in as though it had a story that demanded to be heard. Slowly she turned the pages one by one, expecting to find something trivial, like a journal of mundane daily events. But as she flipped through the pages, she realized there was something deeply unsettling about the words written inside. That was until she made a discovery that would change everything. One rainy evening, Sarah found herself cleaning the basement. It wasn't a particularly large basement, but it was cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and what seemed like remnants of past lives. The damp air in the basement had a musty smell, and the concrete walls were covered in layers of peeling paint. As she sorted through the boxes, her hands brushed against a wooden box hidden in a corner under a dusty old blanket. It was strange that she hadn't noticed it before. It was made of aged wood, darkened by time, and it had intricate carvings that seemed almost too detailed for something so old. Curiosity got the better of her, and Sarah pulled the box from its hiding place. It was heavier than she expected, the weight surprising her. She held it in her hands for a moment, unsure of what she was about to find. But something inside told her that this box had been waiting for her. There was a faint metallic smell emanating from the box as she pried it open. Her heart raced as she wondered what could be inside. The hinges creaked as the lid lifted, revealing the contents, something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Welcome back to Mr. Blackwood, a place where you can experience tension and terror as your bedtime introduction. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and like this video to get more scary stories every night. Now, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin tonight's scary story.